Yo, what's up, fight fans? Welcome back to Combat Cult MMA, Never Back Down. Today we're diving into a rivalry that didn't just define an era, it redefined the word bitter. If you've been following the sport for a while, you know that most beefs are just manufactured hype to sell pay-per-views. We see guys screaming at each other at press conferences only to hug it out and grab a beer once the check's clear. But what we're talking about today was different. This wasn't marketing. This wasn't for the cameras. This was pure, unadulterated, soul-deep loathing. The beef between John Bones Jones and Daniel D.C. Cormier is arguably the most intense and deeply personal feud in the history of mixed martial arts. This went way beyond the octagon. It was a psychological war that lasted for years, tearing through friendships, camps, and the very fabric of the UFC's light heavyweight division. This was a collision of two completely different worlds. The natural-born, chaotic genius of John Jones versus the disciplined, hard-working Olympic grit of Daniel Cormier. Let's get into it. It didn't start in the cage. It didn't start with a ranking dispute or a title shot. It started backstage in the shadows of UFC 121 back in October 2010. At the time, Cormier was a veteran wrestler who was just starting to dip his toes into the MMA journey after a legendary career on the mats. Jones, on the other hand, was already the sport's golden boy, a rising superstar who looked like he was built in a lab to destroy people. When they first met in that hallway, Jones didn't show the typical respect you'd expect a young gun to show an Olympian. He walked right up to Daniel, looked him in the eye with that cocky grin, and said, "Hey, I heard you're a great wrestler. I bet I could take you down." For Cormier, that wasn't just a challenge, it was a massive slap in the face. DC wasn't just a wrestler, he was an Olympian. He was the captain of the U.S. freestyle wrestling team. He had spent his entire life grinding in the room, sacrificing everything to become one of the elite grapplers on the planet. To have some kid who learned wrestling from YouTube and a few years of high school tell him he'd put him on his back, that was the spark that lit the fuse. From that moment on, a mutual loathing was born. It wasn't something that went away after a few months. It simmered for years, getting hotter and hotter as DC systematically destroyed everyone in the heavyweight division before finally dropping down to light heavyweight with one singular goal: to hunt John Jones down and make him pay for that comment. By the summer of 2014, the tension had reached a literal breaking point. We all remember the image. It was a standard media day in the MGM Grand Lobby, supposed to be a routine face-off. But the energy in that room was vibrating. When the two squared off, they didn't just look at each other, they occupied each other's space. They leaned in, foreheads pressed together, and in a split second, it exploded. It turned into a full-scale brawl right in front of the media, with Dave Schaller getting tossed aside like a rag doll as these two monsters tried to tear each other's heads off in the middle of a hotel lobby. This was the moment the world realized this wasn't a game. Shortly after that, the infamous unfiltered interview leaked. You remember the one? The cameras were supposedly off, but the microphones were still live. We heard Jones go from his good Christian boy persona to a cold-blooded killer in a heartbeat, telling DC, "I would literally kill you," and DC responding with equal vitriol. It was chilling. It was real. And it set the stage for one of the most anticipated fights in history. When the first war finally went down at UFC 182 on January 3, 2015, the world stood still. The fight itself was a masterclass in high-level MMA, but it was also a psychological dismantling. Jones did exactly what he promised he would do 4 years earlier. He didn't just win a decision, he out-hustled and out-grinded Cormier in the one place DC thought he was untouchable: wrestling. Jones became the first man to officially take DC down in the UFC, and he did it multiple times. It was a soul-crushing realization for Cormier. He had given everything to this sport, but Jones was the one man he couldn't solve. The result was a unanimous decision for Jones, but the story was far from over. What followed that first fight was a dark era of drama, legal trouble, and absolute chaos that felt like a scripted crime thriller. In 2015, just as Jones was cementing his legacy, his life outside the cage spiraled out of control. He was involved in a hit-and-run accident where he reportedly fled the scene, only to return for his cash. The UFC had no choice but to strip him of his title. This left a power vacuum, and Daniel Cormier was the man to fill it. DC won the vacant belt by beating Anthony "Rumble" Johnson, but the shadow of Jones always loomed over his reign. Fans called him a paper champ, and that ate at him. He knew he needed to beat John to be the real king. The rematch was set for the landmark UFC 200 in July 2016, but disaster struck again. Just 2 days before the biggest event in the company's history, Jones failed a drug test. The fight was scrapped. I'll never forget the footage of DC in his tracksuit, literally breaking down in tears, devastated by the lost opportunity. He didn't want the money. He wanted the redemption. Finally, on July 29, 2017, at UFC 214, the long-awaited rematch happened. The atmosphere in the Honda Center was electric. For 2 rounds, it was a back-and-forth war. DC was landing, finding his rhythm, and it looked like he might actually pull it off. But then, in the 3rd round, Jones showed why he's considered the greatest to ever do it. He leaned in, setting up a pattern, and then landed a thunderous, shin-to-skull head kick that sent DC reeling. A few follow-up shots later, and it was over. Seeing DC cry in the cage afterwards, leaning on Big John McCarthy, remains one of the most emotional and heartbreaking moments in the history of the sport. It felt like the final nail in the coffin of their rivalry. But, as is the case with anything involving John Jones, there was a twist. A month after that spectacular knockout, it was revealed that Jones had tested positive for Turinabol. The MMA world was in shock. The result was overturned to a no contest, the win was wiped from the books, and the belt was returned to Cormier. However, for DC, the damage was done. He famously said the title brought him no joy because, in his heart, he felt like he had lost that night. He had been through the fire, felt the shin hit his head, and no amount of paperwork could change that feeling. The legacy of this feud is complicated. Even though Jones is technically 1-0 in their series with 1 no contest, the conflict never felt truly clean or finished. DC eventually moved up and retired as a double champ and a true legend of the game, while Jones cemented himself as the GOAT, but always with that dark cloud of doping scandals and what-ifs hanging over his head. Even years later, they still trade jabs on social media, proving that the fire of this beef still burns. Now, hold on to your seats because there's a wild new twist that nobody saw coming. These 2 legends have reunited in a setting that is as surreal as it is violent. They've appeared on a Russian version of The Ultimate Fighter called ALF Reality. This isn't your standard corporate UFC production. The show was created by Muhammad Nosayev, better known as Alfredo, a Chechen promoter and a guy from the same circles as Khamzat Chimaev. If you think the American TUF has drama, this show makes it look like a Disney Channel original movie. ALF Reality is absolutely unhinged. The season features John Jones and Daniel Cormier as captains, and the environment is pure chaotic energy. We're talking street fight-style brawls, MMA gloves being used under boxing rules, and a level of psychological warfare that would make a drill sergeant blush. The house is packed with the toughest, most aggressive, and most clout-heavy fighters from across the CIS region. We're talking guys from Dagestan, Chechnya, and all over Russia who live and breathe this life. In this house, a brawl can break out over a single sideways glance or a word spoken in the wrong tone. The violence isn't just scheduled for the cage, it happens every single episode, erupting in the kitchen, the gym, and all over the villa. It's a pressure cooker of testosterone and ego. The highlights from the show are already becoming legendary. You've got Jones and DC reacting to the madness with a mix of genuine shock and their classic competitive banter. Jones brings his trademark dark humor, while DC provides those gold standard reactions we've come to love from his commentary. There was one moment that almost broke the show entirely. A fight broke out and one of the contestants actually pulled a knife. DC was so disgusted and worried for everyone's safety that he actually wanted to quit and fly back to the States right then and there. Jones had to be the one to talk him down, pulling him aside and then telling the contestants to chill out so they wouldn't scare Big Daniel away. But the peace didn't last long. Shortly after, we saw a guy literally break a mop over his opponent's head and another guy reaching for a taser in the heat of a scuffle. This is straight-up shock content, and honestly, it's so wild that I can't even show all the footage here without getting flagged. This is the definition of hidden gem content for hardcore fight fans. One of the most interesting parts of the show is the Minute Challenge. It's a brutal format where 2 guys are put in a small space and told to fight with absolutely no rules for exactly 60 seconds. It's pure carnage. Jones, being the ultimate troll, kept calling DC out to do a minute with him, just for old time's sake. DC, being the smart veteran he is, decided to send in a ringer from his team instead, a guy named Muhammad. Now, Muhammad is from the same region as Khabib, and despite being much smaller than Jones, he managed to time a perfect shot, get in on the legs, and actually take John Jones down. It was a blink and you'll miss it moment that showed the level of wrestling these guys are bringing to the table. We also saw a challenge where the fighters had to wrestle against living legends. There's a guy on the show named Zalek, a total wild card, who actually fought and essentially forced Nate Diaz out of the previous season after a heated altercation. This guy Zalek managed to snatch a wrestling win from Cormier himself, which had the whole house going nuts. On the other side, nobody from DC's team could get close to taking Jones down, except for Coach Muhammad, who is a world-class wrestling champion. The level of technique and raw aggression on display is just different over there. This show is a wild ride, bringing together everyone from UFC-level professionals to YouTube stars, pro boxers, and legitimate street gangsters from every corner of the CIS. It's a fascinating look at the pop MMA culture that is currently exploding in that part of the world. If you want a full, deep-dive breakdown and more inside info on ALF reality, let me know. Since I understand the language and have direct connections to some of the fighters who were actually in that house, I can give you the real story that you won't find on the English-speaking side of the internet. I've got the insights, the backstories, and the drama that the cameras might have missed. This is some of the most fire content in the combat sports world right now, and I'm ready to give you the full scoop. Smash that like button if you want to see more of this. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next upload, and drop a comment below telling me who you think truly won the rivalry, Jones or DC. Share this video with your friends who think they've seen everything MMA has to offer, and I'll keep the heavy hitters coming. This has been Combat Cult MMA, where we never back down and we never stop hunting for the truth in the fight game. See you in the next one. Stay sharp, eat good, and keep training. Peace.